It started with a knock at the door that felt more like a tax audit in envelope form. A man in a neon vest with an electric scooter and a smug grin handed me a certified letter like he was delivering a bomb he couldn't wait to see explode. "You've been served by Sunny Ridge Homeowners Association," he said, as if it was a royal decree. "I live on Remington Ranch, a piece of land my grandfather carved out in 1952 with a pickaxe, a hammer, and an iron will. Sunny Ridge HOA? They didn't even exist until '91. And yet somehow, this letter claimed I owed them 30 years of back dues, totaling $78,453.36. I had to reread the number 3 times just to make sure I wasn't having a stroke. My coffee went cold as I laughed, cried, and then laughed again. And that's when I knew I was about to go to war. I sat at the breakfast table staring at the itemized invoice like it was some ancient scroll of nonsense. They'd billed me for annual dues going back to 1993, complete with late penalties, interest accumulation, and something called a Community Heritage Beautification Levy, which I'm pretty sure is just HOA code for "we want a new fountain." They even added fines for violations I'd never committed: non-regulation fencing, unauthorized vegetable planting, and my personal favorite, excessive independence. I'm sorry, was that an actual charge? Are we billing people for personalities now? I marched down to the HOA office that afternoon, still in my boots and work shirt, dirt on my hands from repairing my tractor shed that morning. The HOA headquarters was one of those beige little buildings that looks like it sells both bad real estate and life insurance. Inside, the walls were plastered with laminated signs saying things like "Community starts with compliance" and "Harmony through regulation." There was even a wall mural of a happy family walking a regulation-sized dog past a regulation-compliant hedge. Behind the reception desk sat Marla. Now, if you've ever met an HOA president who thought they were the mayor, sheriff, and Supreme Court all rolled into one, then you've met Marla. Bleach blonde bob, pearls too tight around her neck, and a permanent expression that looked like she smelled something offensive. She eyed me up and down like I'd tracked cow manure into her cathedral. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that really meant, "Why are you breathing near me?" I placed the letter down on the counter. "You sure can. This notice says I owe you people $78,000 for fees going back 30 years. "Yes, that's correct," she said, tapping her keyboard with long, manicured nails. "According to our records, your property falls within Sunny Ridge jurisdiction." "Sunny Ridge didn't exist when my property was built," I replied. "You folks weren't even paved in until '94. Marla gave a smile that could curdle milk. "That may be, but boundaries shift over time. The community evolved, and your land is now part of the HOA district." "So let me get this straight," I said, leaning in. "You moved your fences, drew your map wider, and now you think you own my land like it's monopoly?" She stood up. "Sir, refusal to pay these dues may result in legal action, including property liens." I laughed. Out loud. Loud enough that 2 other residents in the lobby turned to look. "Lady, my deed predates your entire neighborhood." "Then you'll have to take it up with the board," she said coolly. "But be warned, they've never overturned a fee dispute." As I walked out of that office, I caught a glimpse of their giant district map hanging on the wall. Someone had clearly used a red marker to expand the boundaries in big, bold strokes, just sweeping up nearby properties like they were collecting lost sheep. I snapped a picture with my phone, already knowing this was going to come back to bite them. Back at home, I headed for my old steel filing cabinet. The one that smells like engine grease and mothballs. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out the original deed to Remington Ranch, complete with the 1952 land survey signed by a state engineer. There it was, a legal description that laid out my land ownership down to the fraction of an inch. Not only that, but the property sat outside of any annexation district. Just to be safe, I flipped through a few more dusty folders and pulled out a treasure I hadn't thought about in years, a black and white photo of my grandfather standing in front of the nearly completed house, his name etched on the concrete porch step. That photo wasn't just nostalgic. It was evidence. The next morning, I brought everything to my niece, Samantha. She's a rising star attorney who once sued a corporate developer for ripping out century-old trees, and won. She took one look at the invoice, then the deed, then the map, and said, "Oh, they're in for it." Samantha got to work like a bloodhound on espresso. Within days, she'd uncovered the original HOA incorporation paperwork and their original map. Surprise, surprise, my property was never listed. She also found out they'd filed an expansion amendment years later but forgot to notify a dozen landowners, including me. That's not just negligence. That's procedural fraud. Meanwhile, the HOA doubled down. They sent another letter warning me that non-compliance may result in community blacklisting, whatever that means. A couple days later, I found one of their so-called inspectors walking around my property with a clipboard. He tried to cite me for having a mailbox that didn't match community standard. I told him my mailbox came from a World War II surplus store and had more character than his entire board combined. He didn't laugh. I did. By the end of that week, Marla had filed a preliminary lien on my property with the county clerk. That's when I knew they weren't just playing games, they were going full scorched earth. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They assumed I was just some crusty old man with no fight left in him. They didn't know I had original documents, family history, legal muscle, and a burning sense of justice that flared up every time I looked at that ridiculous invoice. Most of all, they didn't know I don't lose battles on land my grandfather built with his bare hands. If the HOA wanted a war, I was ready to light the first match. The lien hit my mailbox like a brick wrapped in legal jargon. Official county stamp, registered notice, and a cover letter from the Sunny Ridge HOA's so-called legal department, which was actually just a guy named Travis who wore bow ties unironically and once tried to fine a neighbor for hanging wind chimes that played non-compliant melodies. According to the paperwork, the lien meant my property couldn't be sold, refinanced, or legally improved until the full balance of the community fees was paid in full. It was the bureaucratic version of parking a dumpster on my front lawn. My niece Samantha practically cackled when she read through it. "This isn't just sloppy," she said, flipping through the pages, "it's legally suicidal. They're trying to enforce bylaws retroactively on land they never had jurisdiction over. They might as well have tried to fine you for not paying in monopoly money." But the HOA wasn't done. The next day, I found two men in safety vests standing in my yard, one of them holding a tape measure like he was auditioning for a reality show about petty enforcement. "You've been flagged for a Level 2 yard audit," one of them said. "We need to confirm if your fence meets current community standards." I raised an eyebrow. "Current standards? My fence is made of timber harvested by my grandfather. It's lasted longer than your entire neighborhood." He didn't even flinch. Non-compliant materials are subject to replacement orders and fines. When I asked them to leave, they took pictures of my house, mailbox, porch lights, and even my dog, who I'm now convinced is also under HOA surveillance. That night, I installed a motion-activated speaker by the fence that blasted the chicken dance whenever someone approached. Small victories. By the end of the week, I received a new fine for lack of mailbox conformity, unregistered flora, and bizarrely questionable coop presence. Apparently the fake chicken coop I'd put up as a joke got flagged. I'd spray-painted "Property of Karen" on the side, and Marla must have seen it during one of her drive-bys. Yes, she had taken to patrolling the neighborhood herself now, slowly cruising by in her pearl-white sedan like she was casing the joint. I saw her once stop in front of my property and just stare for a full 2 minutes. I waved. She didn't. Samantha told me we needed to build a formal case, not just a defense but a counteroffensive. She dug through the HOA's meeting minutes and found something wild. In 2003, the board had attempted to expand their jurisdiction and submitted a boundary amendment to the county. But they never completed the required notifications or surveys. Not only was it incomplete, it was invalid. They had filed a map with the county showing an expansion that included my property, but according to public records, that map had never been approved. They'd simply acted as if it had been. I stared at the scanned document, eyes wide. They never finished the annexation process? Samantha nodded. They just pretended they did. Which means everything they've tried to enforce on your land is illegal. Meanwhile, Marla doubled down. She sent out a community-wide email accusing me of being a threat to neighborhood integrity, claiming I was abusing legal loopholes to avoid contributing to our shared vision. She even wrote that my non-conforming attitude could endanger property values. That email somehow made its way to the local Facebook group. Big mistake. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who'd had it with Marla's HOA tyranny. Within hours, the thread exploded. People shared their own stories, being fined for planting sunflowers, for having a kiddie pool too close to the hedge line, for having a mailbox that was 1 inch too whimsical. One guy posted a picture of the letter he received after hosting a barbecue that went past 8:01 p.m. on a Saturday. Someone else called her Napoleon in a cardigan. The nickname stuck. With the public turning against her, Marla tried to host a community standards awareness event in the clubhouse to save face. I showed up, front row, with Samantha by my side and the original land deed in hand. As she droned on about the importance of uniform aesthetics, Samantha raised her hand and asked a very simple question. Could you please explain to the community how you plan to enforce your bylaws on a property that legally exists outside your jurisdiction? The room went silent. Marla stammered, tried to pivot, and muttered something about long-standing spirit of inclusion. Then I walked to the front of the room, held up the original 1952 deed, and said, "This house was here when these streets were still horse trails. And no amount of red ink on your maps changes that." To really drive the point home, I projected a blown-up version of their own annexation map, the one with the big red marker lines, and then next to it the official county map showing the approved boundaries. Mine wasn't just outside. It was in a completely different planning zone. The audience burst into murmurs. One older woman raised her hand and asked, "Does this mean all my mailbox fines were fake?" A man behind her said, "Wait, they fined me for trimming a bush that wasn't even on HOA land." Marla's face flushed redder than her boundary lines. "This meeting is adjourned," she said, slamming her little gavel down like it was a courtroom. Someone in the back shouted, "You brought your own gavel to a potluck." People laughed. Someone else called out, "Napoleon in a cardigan strikes again." As Marla stormed out, I looked at Samantha. "You think that shook the tree enough?" She grinned. "We're just getting started." Back at home, I opened a cold beer, sat on the porch, and looked out at the land my family had built with sweat, calluses, and stubbornness. The same land now being treated like some HOA board game prize. Except I wasn't playing by their rules. I had the originals. I had the truth. And thanks to Samantha, I had a plan. This wasn't just about my house anymore. This was about stopping a power-drunk association from swallowing land it had no right to touch. And based on the community reaction, I wasn't the only one ready to fight. Marla had thrown the first punch by weaponizing paperwork and pretending history didn't exist. But she forgot one crucial thing. When you pick a fight with a landowner whose house predates your entire subdivision, you're not starting a debate. You're digging your own bureaucratic grave. And I was ready to bring the shovel. The morning the letter arrived from the Historical Registry Office, I knew we'd just flipped the script. It was official. My property, Remington Ranch, was now recognized as a protected heritage site. Not just a dusty plot of old land. Oh no, we were officially deemed of historical and cultural significance, thanks to a combination of old land grants, my grandfather's original construction logs, and a surprise twist no one saw coming. Apparently, back in the 60s, a film crew had shot several scenes for a Cold War-era movie right in front of my house. One of the scenes had the lead actor leaning against my fence, smoking a cigarette and looking longingly across the prairie. The film wasn't a blockbuster, but it earned enough cult classic status that my porch became a point of interest on some cinephile's blog. Samantha found the clip, forwarded it to the registry as supplemental evidence, and the rest was history, literally. The moment that designation came through, the HOA lost any ability to enforce design, structural, or aesthetic rules on my property. They couldn't touch it. Not my fence, not my mailbox, not even the weathered old tractor tire I'd been using as a flower bed since 1984. Of course, news like that doesn't stay quiet in a place like Sunny Ridge. By noon, Marla was at my front gate, arms crossed, lips pursed, wearing her favorite weapon, a pair of oversized sunglasses that made her look like a moth with a grudge. "You've really gone too far this time," she said, not even bothering with hello. "This heritage designation is a gross overstep. You're manipulating the system." I shrugged. "I just told them the truth. It's not my fault history sided with me." She pointed a finger, trembling with rage. "You're going to regret this. Mark my words." Then she stomped away, nearly tripping over my hose reel. I didn't even bother hiding my smirk. But Marla, being Marla, wasn't out of steam yet. The very next week, I received a thick packet of legalese from a new law firm the HOA had retained. It claimed that they were invoking eminent domain on behalf of community necessity, citing a proposed public improvement initiative that involved building a splash pad, a small playground, and, this part made me snort, a Starbucks kiosk on the outer edge of the neighborhood. The location? Smack dab on the far end of Remington Ranch. It wasn't just insulting. It was comically absurd. They wanted to take my land to install overpriced coffee and a sprinkler fountain shaped like a turtle. Samantha nearly choked on her tea reading through the packet. "They're filing for eminent domain based on a fake improvement project?" she said, flipping through the pages. "They do realize that eminent domain can only be applied for legitimate public benefit and that your heritage designation trumps recreational zoning?" I nodded. "They also think I'm going to roll over because they wrote it in 12-point font." She looked at me and said something that made me sit up straight. "If they faked the boundaries, they might have faked other documents too." That's when we started digging, and what we found was more than just shady. It was outright fraudulent. Turns out, the annexation papers Marla had claimed were approved by the county had a problem. 3 different signatures from county officials, all dated on a Saturday, all with identical pen stroke. When we compared it to official county records, there was no such approval recorded on any public docket. Samantha called in a favor from a friend at the county registrar's office, and we got confirmation in writing. The HOA had submitted the amendment application but had never received authorization. The signatures were not only fake, they were laughably bad forgeries. That was the smoking gun. Still, rather than panic or back down, Marla went on the offensive. She called an emergency HOA meeting to defend the integrity of the board. The flyer for it read like a political campaign ad. "Preserve our vision. Protect Sunny Ridge. Stop rogue actors." I showed up early just to see how far she'd spiral. The room was packed. Residents curious, irritated, some outright angry. You could feel it in the air, that quiet tension of a community realizing their leadership might be a lot less competent than they believe. Marla stood at the front with a microphone like she was hosting a game show. "Fellow residents," she began, "we are under attack by those who refuse to contribute to the community that made this neighborhood great. There are forces attempting to destabilize our harmony, spread misinformation, and dismantle everything we've built together." I could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seat. One man leaned to his wife and whispered, "Is she talking about the guy who owns the ranch?" Another replied, "Pretty sure he built his house before we were born." Then Samantha raised her hand. "As legal counsel for Mr. Remington, I'd like to ask the board to provide the original county-approved annexation documents that give you jurisdiction over Remington Ranch." Marla froze. This is not a legal proceeding, she said quickly. Then why are you enforcing legal claims on his land? Samantha shot back. The room went dead quiet. Marla tried to pivot, claiming verbal confirmation from officials who, conveniently, couldn't be reached. That's when I pulled out the enlarged print of the forged annexation documents and laid it on the front table. People gathered around. Someone gasped. Another person took a photo. Samantha stood tall and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, these are forgeries. Verified by the county. This board has been operating under a false claim of authority over land that was never theirs. And now they're trying to seize that land using eminent domain for a coffee kiosk." Laughter erupted. A teenager in the back yelled, "Starbucks war crimes." The entire meeting fell apart. Residents began shouting questions, demanding answers, even booing. Marla, visibly shaken, shouted, "This meeting is adjourned," and stormed out without even grabbing her gavel. Someone held it up and yelled, "Hey, you forgot your hammer of doom." Back home, I sat on the porch again, sipping sweet tea while Samantha drafted the next move. "We're not just going to defend anymore," she said. "We're going to file a formal complaint with the County Ethics Board and Civil Court. Harassment, attempted land seizure, falsification of document. If we play this right, Marla won't just be out of office, she might be facing charges." I nodded slowly, taking it all in. "You think this'll stop the whole HOA from pulling this kind of stunt again?" She smiled. "It won't just stop them. It'll turn your ranch into the cautionary tale every HOA in the state hears at their annual meeting." That night, I lit up the porch with string lights and played the old movie clip that featured my front fence on a loop. As the black and white actor leaned against the railing and muttered something about freedom and wide open land, I smiled. My grandfather's land had become a battlefield, but we weren't just holding the line. We were winning. And the HOA? They'd just been served a dose of their own medicine, with interest, historical significance, and a splash of poetic justice. The courtroom was smaller than I expected for something that felt so big. Wood-paneled walls, mismatched ceiling tiles, a dusty flag in the corner, and the kind of quiet that made every cough sound like a thunderclap. Still, it had all the gravity of a high-stakes showdown. On one side sat me and Samantha, calm, composed, with our stack of folders, photographs, and a copy of the original land deed that still smelled faintly of engine oil. On the other side, Marla sat like a stone statue beside her lawyer, Travis. Yes, the bow-tie-wearing compliance officer had apparently decided he was qualified to represent the HOA in court. His briefcase was stuffed with color-coded binders, one of which had a glittery, Sunny Ridge Strong sticker on it that looked like it came from a middle school fundraiser. I couldn't decide if I was about to get sued or offered a coupon for lawn care. The judge entered, stern but not unfriendly, the kind of man who probably read property codes for fun. He adjusted his glasses, looked over the case file, and opened with a sentence I'll never forget. "I see we're dealing with a homeowners association attempting to retroactively enforce dues and regulations on a property built nearly 4 decades before its incorporation. Should be interesting." I could almost hear Marla's jaw tightening from across the room. Travis stood first, launching into a rambling speech about community cohesion, neighborhood unity, and how shared aesthetic expectations ensure stable property values. He tried to paint me as some rogue rebel disrupting the peace. I half expected him to accuse me of smuggling wild animals or setting up a fireworks factory in my barn. He presented their so-called map, pointing dramatically at a red line that now encompassed my land. "As you can see, Judge, the current HOA boundaries include Mr. Remington's property, and thus he is beholden to the same fees and standards as any other resident." Samantha stood up like she'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. Calm, poised, sharp as a blade. "Your Honor," she began, "we have no problem with shared community values. But this is not a case about decor or unity. It's about legal jurisdiction. And the Sunny Ridge HOA never had it." She handed over the county's letter confirming the annexation application was incomplete and unapproved. Then she handed over photos of my property's original 1952 survey, zoning maps, and the official federal land patent. The judge took his time reading each document, nodding slightly as he went. This land, Samantha continued, was never included in the HOA's boundaries. The map they submitted is not only unofficial, it contradicts the one on file with the county. In fact, their version of the map was modified without notice, without signatures, and in violation of several procedural statutes. Travis, clearly flustered, tried to object. "But the spirit of the community," he began. The judge cut him off. "Mr. Travis, this isn't a séance. We are not here to summon spirits. We are here to interpret law." I choked back a laugh. Samantha pressed on, revealing the icing on our evidentiary cake. A dated internal HOA email thread, uncovered through a records request, in which Marla wrote to her board, "Even if the county doesn't finalize the expansion, we'll act as if it went through. No one will notice." The courtroom gasped audibly. One woman in the back whispered, "She really wrote that?" "Oh yes, she did." From there, it was a slow, satisfying unraveling. Every point the HOA raised fell apart like overcooked lasagna. Their claim that I used the neighborhood pool? I had receipts showing I'd never even received a key. Their claim I violated lawn standards? My lawn was listed as a native habitat zone under county rules. They even tried to argue that my dog's barking disrupted the peace. Samantha presented a notarized statement from my neighbor stating the noise actually came from Marla's own Pomeranian, which had a reputation for screeching at shadows. The judge listened carefully, asked a few questions, and then sat back. He looked at Marla and said, "Do you have anything else you'd like to add before I make my ruling?" She stood slowly, clearly rattled, and launched into a final speech about how she was just trying to make the neighborhood a better place. "If we allow landowners to defy community expectations," she said, "we lose our shared identity." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And forging documents, issuing unlawful liens, and attempting to seize property for a coffee kiosk supports that identity?" Marla went quiet. Then came the ruling. The judge declared the lien null and void, all fines issued by the HOA unenforceable, and my property officially outside the jurisdiction of Sunny Ridge. He also ordered the HOA to pay for all my legal fees and issued a referral for a fraud investigation into the forged annexation document. The gavel fell with a satisfying thunk that echoed through the chamber like a closing door. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local news had gathered. Word of the case had spread thanks to neighborhood gossip and a now viral Facebook post featuring a photo of Marla holding her gavel like it was a royal scepter. A young reporter shoved a mic in my face and asked, "Mr. Remington, how does it feel to beat the HOA?" I thought for a moment and said, "Feels like I just sprayed Roundup on a field of entitlement." Samantha snorted so loud it made the news clip. The fallout was immediate. Marla was removed as HOA president by a unanimous board vote. Her resignation letter was 2 pages of blaming everyone from the county clerk to social media toxicity. The ethics board opened a formal investigation, and several HOA board members stepped down to avoid scrutiny. The community, once divided by flower color regulations and hedge height disputes, suddenly started acting like a neighborhood again. People hosted porch potlucks, shared tools, and openly mocked the old bylaws. Back at Remington Ranch, I celebrated the only way I knew how, with a community barbecue on the land they tried to take. Families brought lawn chairs and kids ran wild through the field. Samantha gave a little toast, holding up a mason jar of lemonade and saying, "To knowing your rights, standing your ground, and making history." The crowd cheered, and I couldn't help but smile. As the sun dipped low and the laughter of children echoed across the grass, I leaned back in my rocker and took it all in. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about defending a legacy, protecting a piece of my family's story, and reminding people that just because someone has a clipboard and a title doesn't mean they're right. Sometimes the land knows who it belongs to, and it doesn't forget. Not for maps, not for red ink, and certainly not for a splash pad and overpriced coffee. The morning after the barbecue, I found a homemade sign planted at the end of my driveway. It was shaped like an old frontier marker and painted with careful brushstrokes. "Welcome to Remington Ranch, established 1952, still not HOA." I had no idea who made it, but judging by the handwriting, it might have been one of the kids from down the street. I left it exactly where it stood. Something about that sign, in its humor and quiet defiance, captured the spirit of everything we'd fought for. The land had been in my family for generations, and now it wasn't just a property, it was a symbol. Not just of stubbornness, but of freedom, of standing up against pettiness dressed as policy, and of neighbors finally waking up to what they'd allowed to rule them for too long. The fallout for the HOA didn't stop with Marla stepping down. Once the fraud investigation was underway, the County Ethics Board found a string of other concerning practices in Sunny Ridge. Fines that weren't properly documented. Home improvements that had been blocked without legal basis. Invoices for non-existent services. The new interim board, led by a quiet, sharp-minded retired teacher named Mr. Hargrove, called for a full audit. What they found unraveled years of nonsense. Over 40% of the fines issued in the last decade had no valid foundation. Several properties had been wrongly subjected to lien threat. One elderly woman had paid over $5,000 in so-called landscaping compliance fees, only to discover her hedges had never been inspected. Word of the court victory and the audit spread like wildfire. Local papers picked it up, calling it the ranch that broke the board. Even a state housing blog ran a piece on it titled, "How a Cup of Coffee Nearly Got an HOA Sued into Oblivion." My niece Samantha was invited to speak on a homeowners' rights panel in the state capitol, where she was introduced as the lawyer who lassoed the HOA. I told her it was a terrible pun. She told me she secretly loved it. Back in the neighborhood, the change was immediate and almost magical. People painted their houses whatever color they wanted. Someone put up Christmas lights in September just to see if anyone would stop them. No one did. A group of teenagers started a petition to rename the HOA to something less miserable. And the biggest shift of all? Neighbors started acting like neighbors again. Not snitches or silent enforcers, but actual people who helped fix fences, shared power tools, and swapped stories on the sidewalk. The air felt lighter, freer, like a weight had been quietly lifted off everyone's back. As for Marla, she didn't stick around long. After being removed, investigated, and memed into oblivion, she quietly sold her house and moved out of Sunny Ridge. The last anyone saw of her, she was backing her SUV out of the driveway while a group of kids played a kazoo version of Another One Bites the Dust. It might not have been graceful, but it was fitting. Her house was sold within 2 weeks, and the new owners, young couple with a baby and a golden retriever, set up a lemonade stand their first weekend. The sign said, "HOA free and proud." I bought 5 cups, but the story didn't end there. At the next town council meeting, Samantha and I proposed a new ordinance called the Property Sovereignty Clarification Act. It required that any future annexations, HOA expansions, or boundary redefinitions be approved by a 100% vote of the affected landowners, not just a board majority. No backdoor paperwork. No sneaky map. Real votes, real signatures, real transparency. The council passed it unanimously. I wasn't just free from Sunny Ridge. I'd helped build a fence around future overreach, one nobody could tear down with fake forms and red ink. That week, I painted a mural on the side of my garage. Not something fancy, just a hand-drawn map of Remington Ranch with a big circle around it and the words, "Independent since before you were born." People started stopping by to take pictures. Someone even brought a drone to get an aerial shot. A reporter from the housing blog came by and asked me what I thought made the biggest difference. I told her the truth. It wasn't just the law. It was the people finally realizing they'd given up too much control for too little benefit. All it took was one fight to remind them what they'd lost. On the 6-month anniversary of the court ruling, we held another cookout. This time it was bigger. Live music, a bounce house, 3 different chili contests, and a mechanical bull someone borrowed from a local bar. Samantha gave a little speech thanking everyone for their support. I kept it shorter. I just raised my glass and said, "To the land, the law, and the lesson, don't let small people tell you how to live big lives." The applause went on longer than I expected. It felt good. Not just to win, but to see what the win had sparked in others. As the stars came out and the fire pit burned low, I sat once again on my porch, watching the lights flicker across the field. The same field they tried to pave over for a coffee kiosk. I thought about my grandfather, about how he'd built this place board by board, nail by nail, long before any HOA was even a concept. He never could have guessed his old ranch would someday become a battleground for neighborly independence. But I think he'd have smiled at the outcome. Sometimes the fight isn't just about the land under your boots, it's about the principle that built the house you stand in. They thought they could rewrite boundaries and history in one swipe of a red marker. But ink fades. Legacy doesn't. And a man with the original deed and enough stubborn pride can stop even the most organized clipboard army in its tracks. I glanced at the homemade sign by the road again, weathered now, but still standing. "Welcome to Remington Ranch." Still not HOA. And never will be.